Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell. Thank you for joining us for yet another week. It is good to be back from vacation, and it is very good to get to look at another domestic league for a national team that is qualified for the 2026 World Cup. Graham Ruthven, where are we heading this week?
We are heading to the land of Joga Bonito and such. Taylor, how many times are you able to volley the ball off the crossbar like Ronaldinho in that definitely real video?
Just the 6. I can't get to his level quite yet.
That's more than him. So we are heading to the land of Joga Bonito. We're heading to Brazill, who have the theme of these videos, I guess they are videos, they're on YouTube, but on the theme of these podcasts is we are looking at the domestic leagues of each country that is qualified for the 2026 World Cup. So the last window that we had there just before the summer, Brazill, with Ancelotti's first win as national team manager, he's a genius, they qualified officially for the World Cup. So we thought this was a good time to look at that domestic league. And also at the time of recording, Brazilian clubs are doing well at the Club World Cup. So there's a bit of interest peaked in some of the Brazilian domestic teams, and so we thought this was a good time to look at their league system.
It is massive credit to Ancelotti that in his first game in charge, he starts Richarlison, no goals. In his second game in charge, he doesn't start Richarlison. They score goals and qualify for the World Cup. I think he stumbled upon the solution, Graham.
Something to think about. Yeah, someone had only told Spurs.
So this is a topic. As I said, I really enjoy these looks into leagues that we don't always get to talk about, don't always cover, sometimes never talk about, and never cover. I was pretty apprehensive about this one, and I think that was a little bit confusing to Graham. I will speak for you at this point, because I think anytime you have sort of clausura apertura, it's always going to be confusing. That is not the case with Brazill. But anytime you have different leagues and different structures and different things going on at different points, it gets murky in my mind very quickly. And I will say up front, I don't think the Brazilian top flight is as confusing as I thought it would be. That is not the case historically, but since about 2003, I think it's been a more standardized affair.
Yeah, so I can understand why you would think it is. Certainly historically it's been confusing, and they've been through different phases.
Was it 1979? You had 94 clubs in the top flight. That seems unwieldy.
MLS, eat your heart out,
right?
Yeah, incredible. I also came across that in my research. So I think in the modern sense, yes, they have followed the format of the current league that they have, which by the way is called the official title is the Campeonato Brasileiro Série A, which is funny to me because there's basically 3 different league names all smushed together there as if they couldn't decide on just one name. But for the most part, as far as I can tell anyway, people call it the Brasileiro, which in English roughly translates to the Big Brazilian or the Great Brazilian, which I kind of love. So we're already off to a good start with this league. But just to give you a very quick potted history and why historically it's been confusing for Brazil. Obviously, Brazil is a foundational country in the history of soccer as a sport, so they've been playing the game there since the 19th century when an Anglo-Brazilian called Charles Miller introduced association rules in 1894. He helped set up the state league in Sao Paulo, and from there, state leagues across Brazil popped up. And that is an ecosystem that still exists to this day, where before the start of every league season every year, clubs play in state championships, and these state championships are taken really seriously. They're competitions in their own right. So there's one for Rio, there's one for Sao Paulo. They have the oldest one, as I just mentioned, that's the Campeonato Paulista. And for a long time, there was no national league system to speak of in Brazil. So economic factors made it very difficult. It's also a huge country with the world's biggest rainforest smack bang in the middle of it. So difficult for teams to travel to games. There was a cup competition between all the different state champions. Think like the old Club World Cup in 1937. So that was the first real national championship in Brazil. But amazingly, it wasn't until 1971 that Brazil had a true national league. And keep in mind that Brazil had won the World Cup 3 times by then, which is kind of remarkable that they were able to do that without a national league set up. And then from there, I mean, I'm not going to go into every format change, because basically from 1980 until 2006, I think, or 2003,
Yeah.
They changed format basically every single year, depending on the number of teams in the top flight, or the number of tiers, or relegation and promotion systems. They had like an Apertura and Clausura.
Yeah, it seems like also the whims of whichever person was in charge of the government, and especially when it was the military junta, there was a lot of involvement, and a lot of there should be more teams, and even more teams, and even more teams.
Yeah, totally. There was I think in 1979 there was the collapse of the National Federation. They created a new federation, and then in the year 2000 there was a fiasco where basically they failed to organise a league season. They couldn't get a consensus on the format, and so they only played the state championships and the Copa Brazill that year. So now, thankfully, there is a more consistent format, which is 20 teams. It's been that way since 2006. It's a pretty straightforward 38 games, one home, one away against every other team. The team that finishes top is the champion, and the bottom 4 teams are relegated, with 4 teams coming up from the second division to replace them every season. So it's basically the Premier League's format with an extra relegation and promotion place, which would have been bad news for Spurs and Man United last season. So they should be thankful they don't play in Brazil.
So to reset one more time, so you have the state championships. They've been around since the very early 1900s. You have, I believe, 27 different federative units within Brazil. Each one of them has their own state championship. As Graham said, that runs from January until May. Then you get the National League essentially from May to December. Not a lot of rest for a lot of these teams.
No.
It feels like pretty much year-round, essentially.
Well, and that's the thing with the, sorry to jump in, but with the Club World Cup, the argument with the European teams has been, oh, these guys are tired, they play so much football. And I saw a table of the teams at this competition that have played the most games. By a mile, it's the Brazilian teams who are up there. I think Chelsea maybe have the most, with 66 or something like that. I think it's Flamengo have played 78 games in the last 12 months. So, ridiculous.
Very ridiculous. So you have a all-time table, which I'm confused by, because as Graham has already said, since 1971, you've had lots of different formats, lots of different variations, and I think some of the teams in that list, it seems to incorporate state championships or fledgling attempts at national leagues. So it gets a little bit confusing as to who are the all-time most successful clubs. But Graham, if you're going to break it down, who would you say are the biggest players in the Brasileiro? Would you want to go all-time to start?
Yeah, I also looked at that all-time table and kind of gave up. Felt like I needed a degree to understand what was going on there. But in terms
it gets, just for people who aren't as familiar, which includes me, I'm going to say, it gets so confusing so quickly, because you'll look and be like, oh, this team won the league in 2021, but this team also won the league in 2021, but then they didn't compete in 20. I don't understand what's going on anymore.
Yeah, and it comes from a place of they have had this ecosystem where the state championships are basically as prestigious as the league, and so what do you value one over the other if you win the state championship but then not the league itself? Is that worth the same? So it gets very confusing very quickly. But if we are to isolate it in terms of the Brasileiro, the actual league, in terms of titles, Palmeiras are the most successful team in Brazil. They've won the title 12 times in their history, with the most recent coming in 2023. From there, you have Santos with 8, Corinthians and Flamengo with 7, Sao Paulo with 6, Cruzeiro, Vasco da Gama and Fluminense with 4. Then you have Atlético Mineiro and Botafogo. They've won it 3 times. Grêmio have won it twice. What you'll notice in me going through that list is that there is a much wider base of teams capable of winning the title, at least historically, in Brazil than in a lot of other countries. There's been 4 different champions in the last 5 years. So that's Botafogo, Palmeiras, Atlético Mineiro and Flamengo. I don't have it in front of me. Is it Flamengo are the team that have doubled up, I think, in that 5-year period? But besides that, there's a real variety. And there isn't really a truly...
Palmeiras,
is it Palmeiras
think,
that won it twice? Yeah. I knew there was one team that had doubled up. But still, the point stands, there's not really a true dominant force at the moment. Flamengo are top of the league right now. They look really impressive under Felipe Luis. They're also doing well at the Club World Cup right now as we record. But historically, this is a league that's really difficult to win consecutive titles. And as far as I could see, the only team to have ever won more than 3 titles in a row was Santos in the 60s. They won 5 in a row, and they had a certain player, you might have heard of him, he was called Pele. He was quite good at that time. But historically, a very difficult league to dominate.
And were Santos winning the state championships at that point?
I believe they won everything at that time. It's one of the most... When I kind of researched dominant periods for teams, there was a period for Sao Paulo about maybe a decade ago. Corinthians had a period as well. Do you remember they had like Mascherano and Tevez and the Kia Jarabshin era where they had some money coming into the club at that point? So that was like the mid-2000s. Besides then, Santos were the standout dominant force when, they had the greatest player of all time, so that certainly helped them.
Let's go since the turn of the century, since the year 2000, Graham. What do you think is the strongest period for the Brazilian league? I have a nominee if you would like me to go first.
Yes, go ahead.
I would say there's a period from like the late aughts, so around like 2007 until maybe around 2013, 2014, where you have, I think to your point, like the competitiveness is extremely high. You have multiple teams winning the title. I think 6 different champions in 7 seasons. You have a degree of continental dominance where Internacional are winning the Copa Lib, I think, twice during that time period. Sao Paulo winning it in 2005, so maybe you could extend them. And you have other teams making pretty good runs, but that's where you have good domestic managers, you have young players coming through, and then you have a key aspect of this, Brazilian stars returning back to the league, some of them near their prime, so Ronaldinho going back to the league, Adriano, Ronaldo Fenomeno. I always forget how to say that one. It's just phenomenon, basically.
I think it's pronounced Fat Ronaldo.
There it is. Thank you.
That does him such a disservice. I know I just said it, but he was so good. He was a phenomenon.
He was. And so you have more money then coming in from TV deals and sponsorships and match day attendance. You have infrastructure improvements ahead of the 2014 World Cup. And so that, to me, is a period in which like the domestic league is thriving, young players are coming through, and I don't think you have quite as much poaching of 17, 18, 19-year-olds as you do, certainly in the more recent era. So I think of that as being a particularly dominant time period for the Brazilian league.
Yeah, I think another time period that people would point to, certainly in kind of modern history, would be the late 90s, where I remember Manchester United getting beaten by, was it Vasco da Gama in the Intercontinental Cup, and there were teams that really could hold their own against the European teams at that point. And just looking through, it seemed to be a really strong time for managers in the league at that time. So Vanderlei Luxemburgo, who obviously goes on to become national team manager, Luis Felipe Scolari, as well as coaching in the league at that point. It's not long after the original Ronaldo is kind of lured to PSV. I think he played for Cruzeiro, and he was a bit of a prodigy at that time. So I think that was an exciting time for Brazilian football. And at the risk of kind of leaning into recency bias here, I think people would potentially point to now as a good period for Brazilian football, where the last 6 Copa Libs have been won by Brazilian teams. Brazilian teams are really dominating the continental championships at the moment. There's a bit of money. We'll maybe talk a little bit more about this later in the episode, but there's a bit of money flowing into Brazilian football. There's some investment. Transfer records have been broken really recently in that league. And obviously, if a Brazilian team goes further at the Club World Cup, this expanded tournament, as much as Europeans have sort of derided this competition, that will be used by Brazilians to point to their teams being super competitive at this time. So, yeah, I think right now things are looking pretty good for Brazilian teams.
I think it gets murkier for me there, though, because I think at the same time you have a fair amount of financial issues within the Brazilian league, and you have historically dominant teams running into financial issues. Cruzeiro, for example, relegated in 2019 for the first time in their history. They have mismanagement, massive debts. They owed, I think, like $200 million at the time of their relegation, and they kind of had to clean house as a result. The aforementioned Vasco da Gama have had issues, as have Botafogo, Atletico Mineiro, Corinthians. You get like a decently
Santos.
long list, and Santos especially. So that's the weird one, right? Where you have teams that are doing really well, having a ton of success, both domestically, but also in terms of continental competitions, have some big names, be they young or old, but then you also have historically huge clubs running into financial problems, sometimes very severe financial problems.
Yeah, the debt that a lot of Brazilian clubs have is absolutely frightening. But then you look at, maybe this is just the way modern clubs are run, because Barcelona famously or infamously have huge debts.
Right.
Manchester United have debts of $1 billion at the moment. So they're essentially doing what the European teams are doing. I guess just the volatility of Brazilian soccer historically puts me on edge a little bit. You're absolutely right. There are some. I mean, Santos is the big one. Santos have this reputation for being the sort of the talent factory of Brazilian football. And in terms of their actual size, they're not really anywhere near to being the biggest club in Brazil. I think most people would point to Flamengo. They tend to draw the biggest crowds. They're averaging 54,000 so far this season. They play at the Maracanã. Traditionally, they're the richest team. They have the biggest support in the country. I think Corinthians are up there as well. Palmeiras, Sao Paulo, which is obviously one of the biggest cities in Brazil. I think those are possibly the big four. But Santos had this reputation for being this sort of untouchable talent factor of Brazilian football, the club of Pelé, the club of Neymar. And so for them to be relegated, when was that, a couple years ago, or was it even last year, with huge debts was a really sobering moment for Brazilian soccer as a whole.
2023, I think they're relegated. But yes, the point still stands. And I think Santos are a good example of the double-edged sword of the strengths and weaknesses of the Brazilian league, because so often it's Brazil. If a player comes through and is scoring a bunch of goals and looks really good, someone's going to spend some money to buy that player. And you can then sort of subsidize those debts or pay off those debts, and you're like less reliant on... You're always going to be reliant on match day revenue and fan interest and shirt sales and all that good stuff. But there are so many clubs in Brazil that I think thrive by selling players. And that can be very successful until maybe the well runs dry, or as was the case with Santos, you end up having to sell a lot of your very promising youngsters and a lot of your very good players, and you're left with a sort of barren academy and not a lot of money to spend. And that's kind of what I think they ran into. They reinvested, I would say, not wisely. They continued to sell players until they didn't have the kind of prized jewels anymore, and that's where you can run into some level of problem. But even as Santos fall off, for example, you have other clubs continuing to thrive and do really well, to your point, as evidenced by this present Club World Cup. So it's a really, I think, fascinating time to take an interest in the Brazilian league and to look at it in a bit more depth, as we are trying to do on this show, because I think there is always, at least in my mind, an idea that, like, yeah, it's a fine league, but ultimately all the players are going to want to go play for bigger clubs in Europe. And that is still very much the case, but I think it sort of doesn't really give credit where it's due to how strong that league is, how good so many different clubs are at developing talent, bringing through new talent, and staying competitive, again, domestically and in continental competitions as well.
There is always talent in the Brazilian league. That's one thing you can count on. Maybe it's quite transient. Maybe those players are a bit nomadic. Maybe they're always going to go to European football because of the financial gulf. But one thing you can always count on: there's always going to be players that are worth watching in this league. I mean, if you look at the star players now, it's a real mix of prodigious youngsters who will inevitably be picked up by a European team at some point in the future. So Palmeiras have Estevão, who has already been signed by Chelsea, but can't join Chelsea due to labour laws until I think his 18th birthday. So even there, like, that player's already been poached by a European giant. He's still going to play like two or three full seasons in Brazilian football, and that's been the same for Endrick when he went to Real Madrid. I think Rodrigo as well played a good number of games in Brazil before they go to Europe. Another young player, Wesley, is this 21-year-old right back who I saw was being linked with Brighton. Apparently they're going to sign him for like 30 million euros this summer. So the talent pipeline between Brazil and Europe is well established over the decades, and I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. But then you also have a lot of experienced players, like Jorginho has just moved back to Flamengo. Thiago Silva is still playing for Fluminense. De Arrascaeta is the top scorer in the Brasileiro this season. He's 31 years old. Memphis Depay is playing for Corinthians. Seems to be having a good time with his headband. So it's a league that seems to exist on both sides of the spectrum. And somewhere in the middle, there's quality. So according to Opta, the Brasileiro is the best league in the world outside of UEFA. They rank it as the 6th best league in the world. So notably, that puts it ahead of the Eredivisie and Liga Portugal. I do think the best teams in the Netherlands and Portugal are better than the best teams in Brazil. So, and Opta agree with that. So that I did the club ranking as well. They have Sporting, Benfica, and PSV above Flamengo in their rankings. But there's real depth in the Brasileiro, and that's where it has an advantage. There's huge clubs in Brazil. I mean, Brazil's a huge country in terms of its population. It's soccer mad historically, going back over 100 years, and so you do have these massive clubs. I mean, the average attendance in the Brasileiro this season is 26,000, which ranks it I think like 6th or 7th. It's basically kind of similar with MLS, like in terms of attendances. And MLS is one of the best attended leagues in the world. I mean that as a compliment. So yeah, it's there's always quality in the Brazilian league, regardless of the kind of peaks and troughs.
One thing that I'm then confused by, Graham, because I agree with you, there is quality, there tends to be money. We don't talk a lot about coaches. Like, I struggle to think of who is the dominant Brazilian coach in world soccer at present. Like, you mentioned Luis Felipe Scolari. He's the last, like, obvious one that comes to mind. There are certainly successful ones around the world. I feel like you've had different Brazilian managers for Shakhtar. And maybe Dinamo Kiev as well. But largely speaking, I feel like we haven't had a ton of wildly successful Brazilian managers. Do you feel like that is because people... First of all, do you agree with that? And second of all,
yeah.
If so, do you feel like that is because people just assume that it's like, they've got talent, they don't need coaches?
Yeah, possibly. I don't have a great answer to explain why that is the case, but I would certainly agree that it is the case. I mean, I did a very quick Google while you were talking there just to make sure there was no one obvious that I was missing. I mean, there's names there that you know, Scolari being the obvious one, but Carlos Alberto Pereira, Mario Zagallo, like Chiche as well, who was obviously national team manager, Dunga. The people you've heard of tend to be the national team managers. Dorival Jr., who obviously just was sacked as national team manager. Fernando Diniz, who had continental success with, he was Fluminense manager, I think, won the Copa Lib with, and then was sort of moonlighting as the national team manager at the same time. I think Felipe Luis, we might talk a little bit more about this on the main show, on the main feed on Friday. He's the Flamengo manager right now. I think he might be someone to break the mould. Mm-hmm. I think he's a young, obviously the former Chelsea and Atletico Madrid left back, but he is really highly rated. He's only 39 years old. He's got Flamengo playing this sort of very European style, possession heavy, and then they win. Out of possession, they work hard to win the ball back very quickly. So I think people expect him to move to Europe at some point, and maybe he does break that mold. But you're right. I can't really explain that. Yeah. Maybe it is due to the fact that people just take for granted that the Brazilian system is just always going to produce these superstars.
In some of my reading, there seemed to be a tendency to conclude that the Brazilian league generally has moved towards maybe like less jogo bonito, more dour football, more pragmatic football. And I think you have a lot of pragmatism in the approach of the various managers, and maybe Felipe Luis Felipe, Lou Fel, whichever one it is. It always gets a little confusing with him. Maybe he breaks that mold, as you said. But I think that has then bled into the perception of the national team, that you have domestic coaches coming in who aren't elevating the performance and aren't really kind of unlocking the true potential of that team. Hence why Carlo Ancelotti is now in charge of Brazil. The idea that maybe he can kind of kickstart some free-flowing, exciting attacking play once again. Whether or not he does, I'm sure we will discuss Brazil under his tenure at length on the main feed. For now, though, Graham, I do want to talk about the role of the Brazilian league in helping grow the national team, sustain the national team, strengthen the national team, both past and present.
Yeah, I don't think you can overstate the influence of the Brazilian league on the Brazilian national team. Historically, Brazil have won World Cups with entire squads of domestic-based players. I was looking through their 1994 squad, which was the World Cup that they won. Obviously, the World Cup hosted by the US. It was half and half. It was a 22-man squad back then, and 11 of them were domestic-based in 1994. That's still fairly recently. And then in 1982, Brazil didn't end up winning the 1982 World Cup, but that team is widely considered certainly one of the best to not win a World Cup. All but two of that squad in 1982 played their club football in Brazil. So until fairly recently, the Brazilian league, the Brasileiro, was considered one of the strongest leagues in the world. I mean, the best example in terms of how they could keep hold of their players better is Pelé. Widely considered one of the best of all time. For a long time was considered the best of all time. Never played in Europe. And I think that was largely because the World Cup was the defining tournament at that time, and he didn't need to play in Europe to be considered the best, and the Brazilian teams could compete financially against the European teams. So, yeah, historically, there's an absolute direct link between the league and the national team, which is obviously faded over time, certainly moving into the modern age. I think the thing that changed that was the Champions League when it starts in the early 90s. That completely alters the financial landscape for the biggest clubs in in Europe. And just to put some numbers on that, Botafogo, they won the Libertadores last year and the Brasileiro. Their revenue for 2024 was a record amount. It was $97 million, which isn't nothing. But for comparison, Man City's revenue for 2024 was around $800 million. So right there, you see the difference, and the Brazilian clubs have financially been left behind. Nonetheless, there's still this incredible talent factory in Brazil, where, according to CIES, my favourite football observatory, there are 104 Brazilians. This was at the end of last year, by the way. I couldn't find anything more recent. But as of the end of 2024, there are 104 Brazilians playing in the Big Five leagues in Europe. And that was second only to France, who had 115 players at the time. And, of course, France have the advantage of one of the Big Five leagues as their league. So I think you could reasonably say that Brazil is still the most productive country, therefore league. And that's the thing, like we've talked about leagues, countries and leagues like the Canadian Premier League, where the players that were going into the national team, their links to the Canadian Premier League teams were tentative at best. Mm-hmm. Basically every single Brazilian national team player has come through a Brazilian academy. And some of that is down to the historical infrastructure, where Brazil as a country has this incredible network of scouts and local teams, and there's sort of like this funnel where they play for local teams, then they play for a regional team, and then they funnel into a national kind of level team like Palmeiras or Santos. And some of it is kind of this self-perpetuating thing, where because there's such a strong track record of superstars coming through the Brazilian clubs, they are able to sign the best young players before they go to Europe, because they think, well, I'm going to have a great start here and I'm going to do a Neymar, or I'm going to do a Vinicius Junior or a Rodrigo or whoever. So yes, absolutely, there's an incredibly strong link between the Brazilian league and the national team.
Yep. I mean, and that includes 2002. I think there's 12 domestic players in that World Cup winning team. I think if you look at the starting 11, I think it's only the goalkeeper playing domestically. All the same, they are still in there. And I think that is what it's been oftentimes more recently, is that you have domestic players coming in to fill areas of need, to be depth options, to be kind of locker room guys, and you'll get that sort of blend. I think with Ancelotti's first squad, you've got 8 or so domestic-based players, and that ranges from Esteval, the aforementioned, like the young teenager, to more veteran players like Alexandro, who is now back in the league. And so you get that kind of disparity. You get some early 20s in there, you get some late 20s in there, but you will always get at least a few clubs represented in the Brazilian national team. And then to your point, if you look at every single player, they all have at least one Brazilian team on their resume, regardless of how young they might be. That 2002 team has a very young Kaká, still playing for Sao Paulo at that point as well. So you'll get some marquee names before they become marquee names as well.
Yeah, I think 1994, when I was looking through that squad, you had original Ronaldo, who was still playing for Cruzeiro at that time. So you got a preview of the player that was to become at the next World Cup. So there's always that tantalising thing with Brazil, that you might get a glimpse of the next superstar, because they're just so prolific in producing those players.
But with all the positives that we've said about the league and about the role it plays in developing the national team, like, there is a ceiling, though, right? Like, can it become the best league in the world, one of the best leagues in the world? It feels like the money in Europe and the appeal of going to Europe is always going to make it a difficult sell for players to go the other way, essentially, even if you do get the rare exceptions that you've already listed.
Yeah, I think the short answer is no. I don't think the Brasileiro or Brazilian league football can ever be at the level of the Premier League or like La Liga or Serie A or the Bundesliga or the biggest European leagues. Brazilian league football is kind of at this interesting pivot point, because yes, the financial gulf to European football is very much still there, and I don't think it'll ever close all the way up. I think that's permanent at this point. But as I kind of teased at the top of the show, investors are starting to look at the upside of Brazilian league football. So John Textor buying Botafogo is maybe the best example, or Red Bull getting involved with a club. Is it Red Bull Bragantino?
Sure.
Is that pronounced? They're now in the top flight, I think. So obviously these clubs are never going to have access to the Champions League or the Premier League, but there's a huge amount of upside to be exploited within Brazilian soccer itself. I think investors are now looking, and look, maybe this isn't maybe it's not a great thing for an American billionaire to be buying Brazilian clubs. I'm sure there are fans that are unhappy about that, but just talking about the potential of the league, I think they see untapped potential in terms of the league itself. So we are seeing Brazilian clubs spending more on transfer fees and wages. Palmeiras broke the league transfer record just a few months ago to sign Vitor Roque from the former Barcelona player for 25 million euros. Botafogo spent 20 million on Thiago Almada last year. Now that was a bit of an arrangement where he ended up going to Lyon because of the link with Textor, but nonetheless, that's a transfer fee that is attributed to Botafogo. And this is money that is allowing, as I said earlier, that's allowing the Brazilian teams to dominate the Copa Lib. And we're seeing a real gap opening up between Argentina and Brazil. Historically have always been there together, and now we're seeing the best players from Argentina being bought by the biggest clubs in Brazil. There's a financial gulf that's opening up there. So I don't think, as I say, to repeat my point, I don't think we'll ever see the Brazilian league take on the Premier League or whatever, but it does seem to be an inflection point right now where there is growth happening.
And I think if you were going to tune in to watch the Brazilian league, I think like familiarity is obviously always going to help. I think sometimes when we've watched it in the past for the show, not having the kind of background of the club or the manager or the key players coming through, you then, if you're watching it, kind of expecting it to be like a Nike advertisement from the 90s, you're not going to get that necessarily. But when you just get yourself a bit more familiarity, and then you have the atmosphere and the intensity and the rivalries and the occasional red cards. Like, there is still plenty of drama and plenty of stuff to enjoy, even if occasionally it isn't going to be the spectacle that you might expect it to be. But you're still going to get goals. You're still going to get lots of young, exciting players. And you're oftentimes going to get a like, oh, yeah, him. Like Felipe Melo for so long just kept popping up when I thought he had retired. And I am sad that he is no longer playing. At least I don't believe he is, because he made some of those teams very fun and also upped the likelihood that you were going to get a red card at any given moment.
Yeah, Brazilian league football can be very attritional, is one thing that I would say. Not quite on the level of Argentinian league football, which whenever I watch the Super Classico, like, I love the Super Classico. I hope we get one at the Club World Cup, but the games themselves are like, they're the closest thing to Old Firm games that I've ever experienced, where there's not a huge amount of soccer actually takes place, and you can watch certain Brazilian games and there's a similar quality to them, but there's still something exotic and romantic. I mean, Brazil is the most romantic soccer country in the world, and so I'll always have like a fascination with. I would love. I don't think there is over here in the UK. There's not. I don't think there's a broadcast deal for the Brazilian league, but I'd love to watch more Brazilian league soccer, because any time I do catch it, I just find it really enthralling. And
we should know, there are other issues, that infrastructure issues and occasional scandals when you get, you've had some match fixing issues, you've had refereeing controversies, you had one prolonged incident in which you had one specific referee giving out cards, I think, that were like then being bet upon, and you've had different scandals at different points. You've had matches have to be replayed. You get that in a lot of places. So I think at the end of the day, it's a fascinating league with a fascinating history, and one that I look forward to watching more and learning more about as we prepare for the 2026 World Cup, where Brazil will obviously be. Graham Ruthven, hopefully you will be there too. We'll see if we can make all that happen. Maybe you'll even be coaching Brazil, depending on how it goes for Carlo Ancelotti. I think they'd have to go through a few other coaches before they get to you.
Yeah, well, the way they're going the last few years, maybe I will be getting that call pretty soon. When we're all
if
together,
they had to choose between you and Dunga, I feel like they choose you.
No, they would choose Dunga again for a third spell, but everyone would be unhappy about it.
Exactly. I think the casual fan would choose you.
Yeah.
The Federation would choose him for some reason.
Yeah, when we're together, Taylor, just when you're talking about the World Cup, are we going to do the Ronaldinho crossbar thing? See how many? You're going to win that. You'll get the most. But do you think anyone can do it twice in a row?
No.
Volley off the crossbar.
No.
Control, and then another one. I think if we tried hard enough, someone will get it twice. Probably you.
Here's the thing. I think you have to be able to break the instinct of, I hit the crossbar, which is what everybody does when you actually hit the crossbar. And in that moment of celebration, you lose the momentum to then hit the rebound shot that you would need to hit. If you were saying, can I hit it once, then go collect my ball, go back to the same spot and hit it again twice in a row? Maybe. But am I volleying it out of the air the way Ronaldinho totally did, and wasn't it all video interpretation?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah. The most incredible thing that I saw last season was at East Fife, this tiny little kid hitting the crossbar 5 times in a row. Not Ronaldinho style, but going and getting the ball back to the halfway, and not, it wasn't quite the halfway line, maybe like 30 yards out, and then crossbar again. Did it 5 times in a row. Crowd went wild. The game was terrible.
Yeah, I was going to say, sounds like an entertaining affair when that's the highlight. The key, as always, is to aim for the goal, and then you'll hit the crossbar. If you aim for the crossbar,
sure,
then you hit it over, or you'll hit a perfect upper 90 shot. Graham Ruthven, thank you, my friend, once again, for talking about yet another league of yet another team that is qualified for the 2026 World Cup. We've got a few down, and we've got many, many, many still to go.
Thank you, Taylor Rockwell. Uzbekistan next.
Oh, I can't wait, dude. I've already told you, but that's where my wife wants to go for a family vacation. So the more we learn about them, the better. How far away are they from qualifying?
They have qualified. So we've got a few. Uzbekistan, Jordan was another sort of slightly left field one that they've qualified.
All right.
So yeah, it's filled in now. We've got a few options.
You've just promised it, Graham. It's Uzbekistan next. I hope everybody tunes in, because I find those types of reviews to be some of my favorite, because there is always a history. There are always interesting moments, and I'm guessing with Uzbekistan there's going to be a sudden influx of cash that has helped strengthen at least one team or two teams in that league. So until then, Graham Ruthven, thank you again. Listeners, thank you all so much for continuing to listen, continuing to spread the word about Soccer 101. We greatly appreciate it, and we will talk to you next week.